Have you ever heard the phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire"? It's often said with a sense of pride, evoking images of global reach, progress, and civilization. But what if I told you that for millions of people around the world, that long day was a perpetual nightmare? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the polished image of the British Empire to reveal the dark, unsettling truths they conveniently left out of our history books. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about understanding the full, complex, and often brutal story of how the modern world was shaped. So, buckle up, because this is the history of the British Empire, raw and unfiltered. Let us start with the economic engine that powered much of the empire's early expansion: the transatlantic slave trade. Britain wasn't just a participant. It became the world's leading trafficker of human beings. From the 17th to the 19th century, British ships transported over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. These weren't passengers. They were cargo. Men, women, and children were packed into squalid, disease-ridden holds, chained together for a horrifying journey known as the Middle Passage. The conditions were so atrocious that an estimated 15% died before even reaching the Americas. Those who survived were sold like livestock and forced into brutal labor on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations in the Caribbean and North America. The immense wealth generated from this suffering didn't just enrich a few plantation owners. It fueled Britain's industrial revolution, funding factories, banks, and cities back home. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and later slavery itself in 1833, is often celebrated as a moment of moral triumph. But the story is more complicated. The British government compensated the slave owners for their loss of property to the tune of £20 billion in today's money, while the formerly enslaved people received nothing. Absolutely nothing. Their freedom came without land, without resources, and without any form of reparation for generations of stolen lives and labor. The legacy of this economic exploitation and systemic dehumanization continues to affect communities across the African diaspora to this day. Now, let's turn our gaze to India, the so-called jewel in the crown. Britain's relationship with India began not with an army, but with a corporation, the East India Company. This private entity, armed with its own army, systematically dismantled the powerful Mughal Empire through a shrewd combination of manipulation, military force, and economic sabotage. What was once one of the world's wealthiest regions, producing a quarter of global GDP, was systematically Britain flooded the Indian market with cheap, mass-produced textiles from its own factories, destroying India's world-renowned textile industry and plunging millions of skilled weavers into poverty. The land once used to grow a variety of food crops was forcibly converted to cultivate cash crops like opium, which Britain then illegally trafficked to China to fund its tea addiction, leading to the infamous Opium Wars. This ruthless focus on profit over people had catastrophic consequences. Under British rule, India was ravaged by a series of devastating famines. Historians estimate that between 30 to 40 million Indians died from starvation in the late 19th century alone. These weren't simply natural disasters. They were man-made tragedies, exacerbated by British policies that prioritized exporting grain for profit, while millions of its subjects starved. The Bengal famine of 1943, where up to 3 million people perished, is a stark example, with Winston Churchill's government diverting food supplies from the region for the war effort, even as people died in the streets of Calcutta. The story of brutality doesn't end there. In Africa, the scramble for Africa saw Britain carve up the continent with arbitrary lines drawn on a map in Europe. With no regard for the ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities on the ground. This wasn't a peaceful negotiation. It was a violent conquest. In what is now South Africa, the Anglo-Boer Wars saw the British pioneer the use of concentration camps. Over 100,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, were interned in these camps. The conditions were horrific, and disease and starvation were rampant. More than 26,000 women and children died in these British camps. Simultaneously, at least 20,000 Black Africans were also held in separate, even more neglected camps, where their deaths were largely unrecorded. Fast forward to the 1950s in Kenya, during the Momo uprising. The British response to this anti-colonial movement was savage. A system of detention camps, which some historians have called the British Gulag, was established. An estimated 1.5 million Kenyans were forced into these camps and fortified villages, where systematic torture, brutality, and forced labor were commonplace. This wasn't the work of a few rogue officers. It was a state-sanctioned policy of terror designed to crush the Kenyan spirit of independence. The British government fought for decades to keep these records sealed, a testament to the shamefulness of their actions. And what about the settler colonies? In Australia, the arrival of the British was declared terra nullius, meaning nobody's land. This legal fiction ignored the fact that Aboriginal peoples had inhabited the continent for over 60,000 years. What followed was a story of dispossession, massacres, and cultural destruction. The indigenous population was devastated by introduced diseases and violent conflicts over land and resources. In Tasmania, a campaign of ethnic cleansing effectively wiped out the island's entire full-blooded indigenous population. Children were forcibly taken from their families in what became known as the Stolen Generations, a policy of forced assimilation that continued well into the 1970s, leaving a deep, unhealed scar on the nation. In Ireland, often called England's first colony, a long and painful history of oppression culminated in the Great Famine of the 1840s, while a potato blight was the immediate cause. British economic policies and callous inaction turned a crop failure into a human catastrophe. While Ireland starved, food was being exported from its ports to England. Over 1 million people died, and another million were forced to emigrate, forever changing the demographic and cultural landscape of the island. The list of atrocities is long and deeply disturbing. From the brutal suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, where rebels were executed in horrifying ways, to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar in 1919, where British troops fired into a peaceful crowd, killing hundreds of unarmed men, women, and children. The empire was held together not by loyalty, but by fear. It was a system built on a foundation of racial hierarchy, which justified the subjugation and exploitation of hundreds of millions of people. This ideology positioned the British as a superior race, destined to rule over lesser peoples for their own supposed benefactor-civilizing mission that was, in reality, a mission of profit and power. The effects of this history are not confined to the past. The arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers continue to fuel conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. The economic structures they imposed have left many former colonies trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. The psychological scars of colonialism, the internalized feelings of inferiority, and the loss of cultural identity are still being processed by communities around the world. So, why is it important to talk about this? Because history isn't just about dates and famous figures. It's the story of us. It explains the world we live in today, the inequalities, the conflicts, the migrations, and the power imbalances. Acknowledging the bloody truth of the British Empire isn't about shaming modern-day Britain. It's about seeking a complete and honest understanding of our shared global past. It's about giving a voice to the millions who were silenced and honoring the memory of those who suffered and resisted. When we ignore the dark chapters, we learn a sanitized, incomplete version of history. It prevents us from learning crucial lessons about power, exploitation, and the dangers of believing in our own superiority. Only by confronting this difficult past can we truly understand the present and work towards building a more just and equitable future for everyone. The sun may have finally set on the British Empire, but its long shadow remains, and it's our responsibility to step into that shadow and bring the full story to light. Thank you so much for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey through history. If this video opened your eyes or made you think, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And for more deep dives into the history they never taught you in school, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I'll see you in the next one.